One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township. This was a small, quiet, rural community made up of several quiet villages in southern China. The day was very peaceful, and the mother was almost done with her daily chores. She had spent the morning sweeping the stone floors, dusting the simple wooden furniture, and washing clothes by hand in a large basin. She was looking forward to a quiet afternoon, but just as she was putting away her cleaning cloths, she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. This really caught her off guard. Even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds are known to cry a lot, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shai and Xiongwu. Since the day they were born, they had been incredibly easy babies. They never fussed, they never threw tantrums, and they basically just wanted to sleep or lay around quietly. It was like they were living in their own quiet world. At first, the mother felt very lucky to have such calm, peaceful babies. But as the girls got older, their silence became more and more concerning to the family. They were 3 years old now, and they had not even said their very first words yet. They did not even make normal baby babbling noises. They just spent most of their days laying in their cribs, staring at the ceiling, or sleeping for hours on end. The mother had started to worry that something might be deeply wrong with them, but in this rural area, specialized medical care was far away and very expensive. So she had just been hoping they would eventually grow out of it and start behaving like normal children. So when the mother suddenly heard these girls crying hysterically from their nursery, she rushed down the hallway. She wanted to see what was going on. On one hand, she wanted to make sure her kids were physically okay. On the other hand, she was incredibly curious. This was so uncharacteristic for them. They had never made this much noise in their entire lives. The mother burst into the nursery and saw her girls in their crib. They were sobbing hysterically, totally upset, and clinging to one another. The mother rushed over and scooped them up in her arms. She asked them what was going on, and she tried to comfort them, asking if they were okay or if they had a bad dream. But of course, the girls did not say anything back to her. They did not speak. They just continued to cry and sob against her shoulder. The mother carefully assessed her kids. She looked at their arms, their legs, and their faces. She could not see any physical injuries. They did not seem sick, and they did not have a fever. They were just deeply, deeply upset about something, but the mother had absolutely no idea what it could be. So she just stood there in the quiet nursery, rocking them back and forth, and whispering gentle words to comfort them. Eventually, the girls began to calm down. Their breathing slowed, their tears dried up, and they drifted back into their usual deep sleep. The mother gently placed them back into their crib, pulled the blanket over them, and walked out of the room, feeling very confused by the whole situation. A couple of days later, the twin girls were right back to their normal routine. They were totally silent, and they spent most of the day sleeping in their nursery. The mother went about her usual housework, trying to keep herself busy. At some point, she walked down the hallway past the girls' closed bedroom door. She had not heard a single peep from them all day. They had been sleeping quietly for hours. But as the mother walked past the door, she suddenly came to an abrupt stop. She stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. She listened closely because she could distinctly hear her girls making noise inside their room. But the noise they were making did not make any sense to her. Her daughters were not crying, they were not fussing, and they were not whining. They were talking at first. The mother wanted to rush right into the room. She wanted to experience this firsthand, to witness this amazing landmark moment of her daughters speaking their very first words. But then she stopped herself. She worried that if she suddenly burst through the door, she might startle them, and they would immediately go silent again. She did not want to ruin the moment. So, instead of opening the door, she stepped closer, pressed her ear flat against the wooden door, and just listened. As she listened, she really could not believe what she was hearing. These girls were not just babbling random baby words. They were not pointing at things and saying simple names. These girls were having a full-blown, mature, adult-level conversation with each other. They were speaking in complete, complex sentences, throwing words back and forth like two grown adults would. The mother stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. These were the same girls who had never said a single word in their 3 years of life. How was this even possible? But the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. It was not just the fact that her toddlers were suddenly speaking like adults. It was the actual content of the discussion they were having. It made absolutely no sense. Her 3-year-old daughters were talking in deep detail about people, places, and events from a totally different village. It was a village that the mother knew her daughters had never been to in their entire lives. They had never even heard of it, and they certainly did not know anybody who lived there. The girls were talking about specific families, specific names, houses, and very personal stories. Now, in basically any other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a single word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places they could not possibly know about, she would probably panic. She would probably call a doctor, a scientist, or a psychologist immediately. But this mother lived in Pingyang Township, and that meant when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange and unique secret. That secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live in this small rural area, over 100 of them claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing that a few people say to get attention. In Pingyang Township, it is not just those 100 people who believe they are reincarnated. The entire community, all 7,000 some odd people, 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. It is a completely accepted part of their daily life and culture. And so how this actually plays out in real life is very fascinating. Periodically, these reincarnated folks will go up to a non-reincarnated person in the township and make claims based on their past lives. For example, a reincarnated person might approach a neighbor and claim that in their past life, that neighbor's family owed them a large debt. They will ask to be paid back. And the crazy thing is, these non-reincarnated families will actually look through their old records, realize the story matches up, and they will pay the debt without any hesitation. In other cases, there have been physical fights and intense arguments because a reincarnated person approached someone and claimed that in a previous life, that person's relatives had insulted or wronged them. They will demand an apology or a fight right then and there, and the community views this as completely normal and justified. But the interactions between the reincarnated and the non-reincarnated people are not just about conflict and debts. In fact, there have been a lot of major life decisions made in this township designed very specifically to avoid conflict and maintain peace between the residents. For example, there was a little boy in the town who began to claim that he was the reincarnated spirit of a pig. He said he had been raised and eventually butchered in the town. He went as far as to identify the exact local butcher who had slaughtered him when he was a pig. When the local butcher heard about this, he did not get angry or call the boy crazy. Instead, to make sure he was not offending this boy, or potentially offending other residents who might be the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered in the past, the butcher made a massive decision. He shut down his entire butchering business. He just said he did not want to cause any offense or bad, and he would find something else to do with his life. So, when this mother stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of her twin girls having this highly detailed, adult-level conversation about people and events from a neighboring village, as shocking as it was, she instantly understood what was happening. Because she lived in Pingyang, she knew the only possible way her girls could have this information and be able to speak so perfectly was if they were reincarnated spirits. So, this mother did what she thought was the right thing to do. She did not call a doctor, and she did not panic. Instead, she decided to get the word out. She began talking to her neighbors, her family, and people throughout the township, letting them know that her twin daughters were actually reincarnated spirits who had finally started speaking. The mother's hope was that perhaps the families of the deceased people her daughters were talking about in their room were still alive. She hoped they would hear about this, recognize the details, and want to come to her home to meet their loved ones who were now living inside the bodies of her young daughters. Sure enough, less than a week after the mother got the word out, a man and a woman she had never seen before came knocking at her front door. They had traveled from the neighboring village. When the mother opened the door and let them inside the house, something incredible happened. The twin girls immediately looked at them and recognized them. One of the twins ran up to the woman and said that this was her mother from her previous life. The other twin ran to the man and identified him. Then, these two little 3-year-old girls sat down and went on to tell an unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story. They explained that in their previous life, they were not actually sisters at all. Instead, they had been best friends who lived in the neighboring village. They had faced very difficult times and intense emotional struggles, and approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls, they had made a tragic pact. They had taken their own lives together. The twins continued to talk to this man and woman for a very long time. They gave highly specific details about the neighboring village, describing the streets, the houses, and the families. Again, these were places these toddlers had never physically been to in their lives. The girls also shared very intimate, private details about the lives of the two teenage girls, things that only the teenagers and their parents would know. They even described exactly what happened to them when they took their own lives, and they gave the exact coordinates and description of where their bodies had been found by the local search parties. At some point during this conversation, the biological mother of the twins turned to the visiting man and woman. She asked them if the details the girls were giving were actually accurate, and if this was all true. The man and woman, who were crying, nodded their heads and said, "Yes, every single detail they are giving is completely true." Then the twins turned to their biological mother. They decided to answer the questions she had been wondering about for years. They told her that the reason they had remained completely silent up to this point was because they were trying very hard to keep their reincarnation a secret. They were afraid of what might happen if people found out. They also explained that the reason they wanted to sleep all the time was because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss deeply to this day. No one has ever been able to offer a better, more logical explanation for how these two toddler girls had such highly accurate, private, and detailed information about deceased teenagers they had never met and places they had never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works for the people of Pingyang Township is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. To this day, Pingyang Township remains a major hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody really knows why it happens there. Now, we are going to move on to our next story. This next story is going to sound incredibly far-fetched once it gets going, but you have to stick with it. Because by the end of this story, there is an absolutely crazy plot twist. This is truly one of the best historical mysteries we have found in a long time, so definitely stick around until the very end. On a warm spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny, isolated settlement called Eagle Creek, which was located in the rugged territory of Arizona. While Sarah was busy cleaning up the inside of the house, her sister Elizabeth grabbed a heavy wooden bucket and headed outside. She walked down the path to get some fresh water from their outdoor natural spring. Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this small timber farmhouse along with their respective husbands and their children. The American West at this time was an incredibly sparsely populated, wild, and dangerous place. Because of the constant threats from the harsh environment and outlaws, it was not uncommon for families to band together and share a home like this for safety. While the two husbands spent their long days out on the dry range, herding the sheep and working the rugged land, Sarah and Elizabeth stayed back to look after the home and take care of their collective 4 young children. On this particular afternoon, as Elizabeth was outside gathering water, Sarah continued her house chores. She kept one eye on the 4 children who were playing quietly in the main room, making sure they were safe and behaving. But all of a sudden, the quiet afternoon was shattered. The family's large guard dogs, who were leashed up outside near the barn, began to bark incredibly aggressively. For Sarah, this was immediately alarming. The dogs were usually very docile, friendly, and spent most of their days sleeping in the shade. They rarely made any noise at all. So, hearing them bark with such intense fury and fear meant that something was definitely happening out there. Sarah quickly told the children to stay exactly where they were and not to move. She rushed to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the wooden porch to see what had set the dogs off. Once she was out on the porch, Sarah immediately began scanning the wild landscape in front of her. To her left and to her right, there was nothing but the usual rocky scrub, dry brush, and dirt. But right in front of the farmhouse, there was a large, steep, sandy hill. This hill was so big that it completely obscured their view of the trail leading off into the distance. Sarah noticed that the dogs, who were pulling hard against their leashes in the front yard, were staring directly at the top of that sandy hill, growling and barking frantically. At first, Sarah could not understand what they were barking at. She stared at the hill, looking for any sign of a coyote, a stray cow, or maybe a traveler, but there was absolutely nothing there. But then, as she continued to watch the top of the hill, she saw something emerge over the crest. A massive, terrifying creature began to slowly make its way down the hill, heading directly toward her house. It was a giant 4-legged beast with thick, matted red fur. Its back was strange and completely twisted up. But what made Sarah's heart stop was what was sitting on the back of this creature. There was a man riding it, but this was not a normal-looking man. As the creature got closer, Sarah could see his face. It was horrific and sunken, with dry skin clinging to the bones. The man's mouth was twisted into a massive, unnatural, toothy grin. And as she stared at his face in total shock and disbelief, she realized that he had no eyes. There were just dark, empty sockets staring back at her. Sarah was a deeply religious woman who spent her evenings reading her Bible by candlelight. As she stood on the porch, watching this massive red beast and its eyeless, grinning rider charge directly toward her, her mind went to the darkest place possible. She became absolutely convinced that she was looking at the literal devil. She believed the devil was riding this red monster of the apocalypse, and he was coming to claim her and her young family. Instinctively, panic took over. Sarah turned around, bolted back inside the farmhouse, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. She quickly dropped the wooden latch into place, and then, using all of her strength, she dragged the heavy wooden kitchen table across the floor and wedged it tightly against the door to barricade it. She then rounded up the 4 terrified children, pulled them into the corner of the kitchen, and huddled over them. She covered their ears and began praying to God at the top of her lungs, begging him to save them from the evil outside. But as she was praying, a sound cut through the air. It was a loud, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere outside. Sarah froze. She knew that scream. It was far too human to be coming from the devil or the red creature. It was the sound of a woman in absolute terror. Sarah instantly realized that the scream was coming from her sister, Elizabeth, who was still out by the water spring. But Sarah was so paralyzed by her own fear, and she felt such a deep responsibility to protect the 4 young children huddled beneath her, that she simply could not bring herself to move. She could not leave the safety of the barricaded house. So, instead of running outside to try and save her sister, she just squeezed the children tighter, closed her eyes, and continued to pray. She hoped and prayed that Elizabeth would somehow survive whatever was happening outside. Hours passed. Sarah remained huddled in the corner of the barricaded kitchen, holding the children and listening to the silence. Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not returned to the house. Sarah felt an immense weight of guilt and horror. She wanted desperately to go out and look for her sister, but she was still too terrified of the grinning devil that she believed was waiting for her in the shadows. But just then, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps walking onto the wooden porch. Then, she heard the front doorknob turn. The door rattled as someone pushed hard against it, but the heavy kitchen table held the door firmly in place. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. She thought the devil had finally come back to get them. She and the children began to scream in terror. But then, through the thick wooden door, Sarah heard the sound of two very familiar voices calling out. It was the voices of her husband and Elizabeth's husband. They had finally returned from their long day of herding sheep, and they were confused as to why the house was completely locked up. They called out, asking what was going on and demanding to be let inside. A massive wave of relief washed over Sarah. She rushed to the door, shoved the heavy kitchen table out of the way, threw open the latch, and flung the door wide. She immediately burst into tears, sobbing hysterically. She began babbling about the red beast, the grinning devil with no eyes, and the horrible screams she had heard hours ago. She told them that Elizabeth had gone to the spring to get water and had never returned. The two husbands were instantly incredibly concerned. They had no idea what to make of Sarah's wild story about the devil, but they knew that Elizabeth was missing, and that was a very real danger. The men did not hesitate. They grabbed their rifles, lit their lanterns, and headed out into the growing darkness toward the outdoor spring to find Elizabeth. The two men made their way down the dirt path, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows across the rocks. At first, they walked quickly, calling out Elizabeth's name into the quiet night. But when they got no response, their worry turned into panic, and they broke into a full run. As they rounded the corner and arrived at the natural spring, they stopped. There, lying face down in the wet mud, was Elizabeth. There was blood all around her, and she was completely motionless. Elizabeth's husband rushed over and collapsed beside her, weeping over her body. But it was too late. Elizabeth was dead. While Elizabeth's husband mourned, Sarah's husband rode his horse at a gallop into the nearest town to fetch the local coroner so they could find out what had happened to her. To the two husbands, the cause of death seemed fairly obvious. There were massive, deep animal tracks and hoof prints pressed into the mud all around Elizabeth's body. It looked like she had been violently trampled to death. The coroner eventually arrived at the scene and began his investigation. He looked at Elizabeth's body and agreed that her injuries were consistent with being trampled by a massive animal. However, when he got down on his hands and knees to examine the hoof prints in the mud, he ran into a major problem. These prints were absolutely massive. They were far too large and the wrong shape to be the prints of a horse, a mule, or an ox. The coroner literally told the family that he could not say she was killed by a horse because whatever animal made these tracks was something completely different. The coroner then spoke with Sarah to get her statement. Sarah described the entire event in detail. She told him about the massive red creature that came over the hill and the terrifying, eyeless, grinning man riding on its back. She insisted that the devil himself had trampled her sister to death. Now, the coroner agreed that Elizabeth had likely been trampled by a giant, powerful beast. But he absolutely did not believe the supernatural details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the literal devil was riding a monster through the Arizona desert, but because he could not identify the animal tracks, and he could not find any other logical explanation, the coroner ultimately decided to list Elizabeth's official cause of death as unknown, but the coroner's doubts did not stop the rumors from spreading. Word of the incident quickly traveled from ranch to ranch, saloon to saloon, across the entire Arizona frontier. Before long, basically everyone living in the territory had heard the terrifying story of the devil and the red beast. The locals even gave the creature and its rider a nickname. They called them the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard the stories figured it was just a myth. They thought it was an exaggeration, a scary story told around campfires, or just some local lore passed around by superstitious settlers. But over the next few years, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent, and they became much more strange. Campers sleeping deep in the Arizona wilderness began reporting terrifying encounters. They claimed that in the dead of night, a giant red creature would suddenly charge out of the darkness and trample directly over their tents, destroying their gear and scattering their horses into the desert. One group of prospectors claimed they woke up to see a towering figure standing over their campfire, its skeletal face grinning at them in the moonlight before it vanished into the brush. One day, a brave cowboy actually managed to get close to the creature. He was riding his horse through a rocky canyon when he spotted the red ghost grazing on some dry brush. Hoping to capture the beast and solve the mystery, the cowboy readied his lasso. He rode up close, swung his rope, and successfully threw it around the creature's neck. But the red ghost did not react like a normal wild horse. It let out a deep, terrifying roar, turned and bolted with incredible speed and power. The force was so immense that the cowboy's horse was nearly pulled off its feet, and the cowboy himself was dragged from his saddle. He was scraped and bruised against the rocks, and he had to quickly let go of the rope to save his own life. The red ghost disappeared into the desert, still wearing the cowboy's rope. Stories like this continued for an entire decade. The legend of the red ghost grew larger and larger until one morning in 1893. A farmer named Harrison, who lived in eastern Arizona, happened to look out his window early in the morning. He was checking on his crops, and there, standing right in the middle of his turnip patch, was the red ghost. Harrison had heard all the rumors and stories about the red ghost over the years. He had already made up his mind about exactly what he would do if he ever came face to face with the legendary monster. He was going to shoot it. Harrison did not hesitate. He quietly grabbed his loaded Winchester rifle, walked over to the window, and aimed it right at the beast. He took a deep breath, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The loud gunshot echoed across the valley, and the red ghost collapsed to the ground, falling right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once he was sure the creature was down and no longer moving, Harrison ran outside. He hurried over to the turnip patch, eager to finally see what the heck this monster actually was. He wanted to see what had been terrorizing the Arizona territory for the last 10 years. But when he got to the carcass and looked down, he realized that all of the supernatural stories and legends had been completely wrong. It turned out that the red ghost was not some mythical monster from another world. Instead, it was a combination of two very real, very mortal beings. The first of these beings was a creature that if you saw it today, you would recognize it instantly. But for the average settler living in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have had absolutely no way of knowing what it was, because they had never seen one before. The beast had thick red fur, a long neck, and a large humped back. It was a camel. It turns out that back in the 1850s, a man named Jefferson Davis, who was the United States Secretary of War at the time, decided to launch a unique military experiment. He believed that camels would be much better suited for hauling heavy military supplies through the dry, arid deserts of the American Southwest than horses or mules. So the military imported dozens of camels from the Mediterranean and created what was known as the U.S. Camel Corps. The experiment was actually quite successful at first, but when the American Civil War broke out, the military abandoned the project. Many of the camels were sold off, but several of them either escaped or were simply released into the wild. These camels managed to survive, adapt, and roam freely through the harsh deserts of Arizona. This explained the giant red beast, and it also explained the massive, soft, two-toed hoofprints that had baffled the coroner at the scene of Elizabeth's death. But the camel alone was not what had terrified the settlers of Arizona and created the legend of the red ghost. What really created the terrifying legend was the rider. When Sarah had looked out from her porch 10 years prior, she had seen a rider on the camel's back. She had seen a face with no eyes and a massive, terrifying, toothy grin, and she believed it was the devil. But she was actually right about one thing. It was a human being. The rider of the camel was a real man. But he was not riding the camel willingly. He was a decomposing human corpse. It turned out that at some point, many years prior, this man had been placed on the camel's back. His body had been incredibly tightly bound and lashed to the heavy wooden saddle using thick leather thongs and ropes. We do not know who this man was, and we do not know how he died. Some historians believe he may have been a soldier, a prospector, or a traveler who had been captured by bandits or hostile forces, and he had been tied to the wild camel as a form of execution or torture, and then the beast was set loose in the desert. Because the leather ropes were wrapped so tightly around his arms, legs, and torso, when the man eventually died, his body did not fall off. He remained held in an upright, seated position on the camel's back. As the camel wandered the desert for years, searching for food and water, the hot sun and scavenging birds did their work. The man's flesh and eyes slowly rotted away, exposing his skull. This left him with empty eye sockets and a permanent, wide, skeletal grin where his lips had peeled back. For 10 long years, this wild camel had roamed the hills of Arizona, carrying the skeletal remains of this unknown rider. To anyone who saw them from a distance in the desert heat, it looked exactly like a terrifying supernatural demon riding a red monster. Today, the story of the red ghost remains one of the most famous and bizarre pieces of folklore in the history of the American West. In fact, if you ever travel to the small town of Quartzsite, Arizona, you can find a permanent stone monument topped with a metal silhouette of a camel. It was built to honor the strange history of the U.S. Camel Corps and to remember the legend of the red ghost that once haunted the desert. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sure to imagine looking out your window and seeing the literal devil charging toward your house, riding a giant red monster with an eyeless, grinning skeletal face. In 1883, a terrified Arizona settler named Sarah watched this horrific beast sprint down a hill. Moments later, her sister was found violently trampled to death in the mud. For a decade, campers and cowboys reported encounters with this same red ghost, claiming a demonic, grinning figure was hunting humans in the desert night. In 1893, a farmer finally shot the monster down. When he approached the carcass, the supernatural legend completely shattered. The monster was actually a stray camel from a failed US military experiment. But the rider? It was a real human corpse, tightly lashed to the saddle, rotting under the desert sun. Who was this dead rider? Check the link in the comments. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnick was just finishing up with his last patient of the day. His practice was located in the small rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed the patient a free toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup, and then he walked into his back office to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything together, he walked out through the reception area. He told his receptionist to have a wonderful night, and she waved back and gave him a big, friendly smile. But as soon as John stepped out of the building and the door closed behind him, that cheerful expression completely vanished from his face. The truth was, John had a lot of problems weighing on him, and pretending to be happy and untroubled all day at work was becoming incredibly exhausting. And so, John walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his dental practice to the small house he was living in. John had actually grown up right there in Blairsville. It had been his lifelong dream to build a life and raise a family in his hometown. So, when he graduated from dental school about 13 years earlier, he had a choice. He could have easily set up his practice in a big city and probably made a much higher salary right from the start. But instead, he decided to come home and join the practice of his own childhood dentist right there in downtown Blairsville. And it turned out to be a great decision. John was able to make a lot of money in his hometown. His dental practice really took off, partly because John himself was just a really charming guy. He was great with kids, and so families from all over the area wanted to come to him. With the extra money he was making, which was way more than he ever expected, he started investing in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnick was a millionaire. But it wasn't until he met his wife, Michelle, that he truly felt like his life was complete. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children already, and for John, this was perfect. It meant she came with a ready-made family that he could love as his own. Some of John's friends were a bit worried. They thought maybe Michelle was only interested in him for his money. But then, John's mother got sick with cancer, and Michelle stepped up without hesitation. She became his mother's full-time caregiver, looking after her with incredible compassion. For John, that was all the proof he needed. He knew then that Michelle truly cared for him and his family, and so the two of them got married in 1997. Shortly after their marriage, they adopted a little boy together who they named JJ. Now, with their 3 children, this big, new family moved into a beautiful house with a swimming pool and a hot tub. On the outside, it looked like everything was absolutely perfect, but now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of his current home, it was a much more modest place. He just sat there for a moment, staring at this little house he was living in, and he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely. These days, John was extremely tight on money. He was a generous person, and he'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the difficult position of having to ask for that money back because he literally needed it to get by. And then there was his marriage. He and Michelle had hit a horrible rough patch that just never seemed to end. They had both admitted to having affairs, and so now they were living separately. That was why John was pulling up to this small, quiet house instead of the big family home with the pool and the hot tub. But as bad as the financial stress and the marital problems were, they weren't the worst thing in John's life. There was a third stressor, one that was far more terrifying. John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. This fear had started about 2 weeks earlier. Someone had vandalized his car with spray paint. The police had looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And on its own, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to kill you. But for John, it just felt different. It felt personal, like someone was specifically targeting him. And over the next several days, that feeling grew from my car was vandalized to my car was vandalized, and I think it means someone is trying to kill me. John believed this so strongly that he had recently gone to see his attorney. He gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her it was just in case he ended up dead. She could use that money to help investigate his murder. Now, John finally got out of his car. He walked up the porch steps, went into his home, and closed and locked the door behind him. The house was so quiet, and it just made him feel even more depressed. He wished his adopted son, JJ, was there. JJ always made the house feel so much more alive. But these days, John didn't get to see him very much. Long stretches of time would pass between their visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents that he had been avoiding. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but she and John had never been able to come to a final agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to try and save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The reason the divorce had dragged on for so long was because of what they were fighting over. It was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, and John absolutely refused to give up his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last settled on a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so, John sat down on his couch and turned on the television. But he couldn't focus on the show. He was just too restless, too anxious. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close with. He talked with her for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He stretched out on the couch, and right there in the living room, he fell asleep. The next day, around 3:30 in the afternoon, a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived right next door to John, walked out of his front door and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, was around and could come out to play. He wasn't sure if JJ would be there since he split his time between his mom's and his dad's places, but he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped. He noticed something was wrong. There was a small glass panel to the left of the front door, and it had been completely shattered. There was broken glass all over the porch, and Zach could also see streaks of what looked like a dried, red liquid right underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He saw it and thought it had to be blood. His first instinct was to turn and run away as fast as he could, but then he thought about his friend, JJ. He was worried that maybe JJ was inside and in some kind of trouble. He couldn't just leave him. So, gathering up all the courage a 9-year-old boy could, Zach slowly and nervously walked up the rest of the steps to the front door. He tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. And so, as carefully as he could, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel, trying his best not to cut himself on the sharp edges. He reached inside and was able to turn the lock from the inside. Then he opened the door. As soon as he stepped into the house, he saw it. There were papers strewn all over the floor of the foyer, and in the middle of it all, there was a body. It was laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach didn't hesitate. He turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lade of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving in her car with her husband and their 4 children. She got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a little confusing. All dispatch could tell her was that there had been a cardiac arrest and that she was needed at the scene. There was no other information. So, thinking it was probably a routine medical call, like a heart attack, Corporal Lade just drove her family straight over to the address. But when she pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she knew immediately that this was not a simple heart attack. She saw a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and the look on his face was grim. Lade walked over to him, and he immediately pointed to the broken glass panel and the dark stains on the ground. She asked him what was going on. She told him she was told this was a cardiac arrest. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and see for yourself." So Lade turned and waved to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she just needed a minute. Then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was stunned by what she saw. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, and there, in the center of it all, amongst all the scattered papers, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen in her life. Now, Corporal Lade had never actually worked a homicide case before, but as she stood there trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the man's body, she knew without a doubt that this was not a cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup and she needed it fast. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a medical emergency, the police had not sent a full response. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. Lade was suddenly very aware that the killer, or killers, could still be in the area, maybe even still inside the house. They hadn't even secured the property yet, and she was thinking about how she had brought her husband and her children with her. They were sitting in the car right outside, so she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house. Then she went back out onto the front lawn to essentially stand guard between the murder scene and her family, her hand resting on the gun in her holster. Luckily, it wasn't long before Lade heard the sound of approaching emergency sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came out of the house and told her it was empty. The killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery the officer had made was a huge puddle of blood in the basement, where the victim's blood had seeped through the floorboards from above. At this point, Lade said goodbye to her husband and kids and sent them home. Then she went back into detective mode and stepped back inside the house. It was around then that someone on the scene told Lade the victim's name. They said his name was John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians began their work, carefully processing all the physical evidence inside the house, Lade started a slow walk through each of the rooms. She was trying to get a sense of who John was and also to piece together how he had died. John's body was found close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that led to his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also covered in those divorce papers. John's body was barefoot, but there were bloody shoe prints in the house that were far too big to belong to the little boy, Zach. Lade figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As Lade continued through the house, she didn't see anything that looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The television was still there. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened or rummaged through. And to Lade, this made sense. The murder was extremely violent, which suggested it was very personal. It seemed like the only thing the killer wanted when they came into this house was for John to die a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the home, ending up back in the living room where it looked like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and the note were from someone named Melissa, and when Lade saw the last name, she did a double take. It was Use, the same last name as the neighborhood boy Zach who had discovered the body. Lade wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, and so now, Corporal Lade realized that right there on the coffee table she had her first two solid leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce, and two, someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that she apparently couldn't afford to pay back all at once. It was evening by the time Lade finally stepped back outside the house. When she did, she saw a crowd had gathered. There were neighbors and reporters all jostling for position out on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, so Lade knew this was going to be a huge story. But for now, she just had to get past them and get back to the station. She needed to get organized for the interviews she'd be conducting tomorrow. But before she could even walk down the front steps, another officer came over to her with an update. Over the past few hours, police had fanned out across the neighborhood, talking to people to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. And they had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, she had been woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she had eventually just gone back to sleep. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling, and it sounded like a very heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, when Lade heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to add a lot more weight to the idea that money might have been the motive for this murder. But the officer said he wasn't finished. He had one more important piece of information for her. In addition to those witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really needed to look into. And that was the Use family. Because, according to the neighborhood gossip, Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Corporal Lade was at the police station. She was sitting at a table inside an interrogation room, directly across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Again, Lade had never worked a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for how she was going to handle her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin. And the reason for that was simple. She had been told that in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Lade had sent an officer to Michelle's house to tell her that her estranged husband was dead. But when the officer got there, Michelle already knew. She said she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So the officer had to break the news to both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin that it was actually a murder. And according to the officer's report, they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Lade actually knew Michelle's boyfriend, Kevin, personally. He was a state police trooper, and they had worked together on cases before. But now, Lade was going to have to investigate her own colleague, which was obviously a very delicate situation, especially among police officers. And so, what Lade wanted to do was gather more information before she spoke directly to Michelle and Kevin. First, she wanted to try and rule out the Uses as suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Lade looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. She began by asking them about the $15,000 check that Melissa had written to John, the one found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, kind of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she was really disappointed when he did that, but she also knew John was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said she only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check. That's why she had left the note with it, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she could get the last $1,000 together. Lade watched Melissa closely as she spoke. She did seem truly distraught over John's death. The money issue really didn't seem to be a big deal to her at all, compared to the loss of her friend. But the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question, and Lade decided she couldn't just dance around it, even though Melissa was sitting right there next to her husband, Tom. Lade looked directly at Melissa and asked her straight out if she was having an affair with John. Melissa immediately blushed and said no. She insisted they were just close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lade turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a second, Tom just sat there in silence. But when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. He basically refused to answer the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go and take care of his kids. Now, Lade knew it had been a very blunt question to ask, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. So by the time Lade told Melissa and Tom that they were free to go, Tom had firmly established himself in her mind as a clear person of interest. Before Lade left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers, who she had sent to observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular vein had been cut by a piece of glass. John also had defensive wounds on his hands as well as cuts on his back, which suggested that at one point he had tried to run away. Lade already knew it was a brutal murder, but hearing the details from the autopsy just reinforced how much hatred must have been behind it. And so, after hearing these details, Lade thought to herself that whoever did this must have truly, deeply hated John. And she was already thinking she had one suspect, Tom Hughes, whose wife might have been having an affair with the victim. That would certainly be a powerful enough motive to inspire that level of hatred. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lade felt confident that she would be able to solve this as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, just like she always had on every other case. But this case was already getting a lot of attention in the news. And so, Lade knew there would be pressure to show results and to show them fast. If she moved too slowly, the case might get taken away from her, or another police agency might be called in to help speed things up. Lade didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her methodical process. She figured she would just have to find a way to strike a balance. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with some evidence: John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and some tissue samples. Lade was supposed to send these off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Lade decided, now that she had these samples in her possession, that she was not going to do that. Lade wanted to keep all of her investigative options open and to make sure that she knew every single thing that was happening with her evidence in this case. And so, after the officer left, Lade took the samples to the department refrigerator, put them inside, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Lade had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They had all painted a picture of John as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Lade was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as she arrived at the office, she was glad she had come. The dental hygienists and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. During the long, multi-year divorce battle, Michelle had at one point accused John of abusing their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press any charges. But during all the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order. The police had come and arrested him right there at his work, in front of his colleagues and patients. So, to John's colleagues, Michelle was a total nightmare. They also said she called the office regularly to demand money and that John often caved in and just gave it to her. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to even speak to her. This detail definitely caught Lade's attention. It wasn't just the colleagues at the dental practice who said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. John had never really felt comfortable with that kind of flashy lifestyle, and to many of his friends and colleagues, it was that fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. And so Lade started to wonder. Maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money just a few days before his murder. Maybe Michelle had called demanding money, and John, for the first time, refused. Could that have been enough to push Michelle to murder him? It was possible. But then Lade discovered something else. Michelle was still listed as the beneficiary of John's life insurance policy. If John died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now there was a twofold financial motive for Michelle to want John dead. But it didn't seem likely that Michelle on her own would have been able to overpower John and inflict all those wounds. It just seemed like he would have been able to fight her off. But Lyde thought maybe Michelle hired someone to do it. Someone bigger and stronger. She certainly would have had the money to pay for it. As Lyde left the dental office, she began to think about how she was going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Lyde did not want to make her move too soon, not without more evidence. This wasn't just the first murder case she had ever worked. It was the biggest case, period, that she had ever handled. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she did not want to screw it up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after the murder. Corporal Lyde knew that his friends and family were already starting to get antsy. They wanted to know why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly, and Lyde understood where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure to solve this case right away. That was weighing on the friends and family. And then there was the fact that John himself had been so paranoid that he was going to be murdered. And now he had turned up dead. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. But Lyde also felt that John's family just didn't understand why this was taking so long. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to work a homicide, Lyde had developed her own very careful method. And for the next several months, she continued to follow her own protocol. She took her time, but she did it with intention. The crime scene unit hadn't turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene. The bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of her suspects. So for now, Lyde was relying heavily on interviews. And she ran down every single tip and rumor she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her 3 best suspects: Tom Hughes, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes, the complaints from the public and from John's own family about her failure to solve the case more quickly did get to her. But she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Hughes hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2000, about 3 months after the murder, when Lyde got a call from Melissa. Lyde was actually pretty surprised to hear from her, and she was even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Lyde showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with 2 older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had visions about the case. Lyde was not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter his house. But Lyde also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics that one of her suspects' wives had hired, then that's what she was going to do. So Lyde followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lyde was doing her best not to roll her eyes. Then they went into the house, which still hadn't been cleaned out and was still splattered with blood. The psychic sisters had a premonition. They said the killing had happened in the dining room area. Then the psychics said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed really excited by all of this. But to Lyde, it was all ridiculous. The blood they were literally looking at made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation had been all over the news. The things the psychics were saying were things anyone could have easily learned before showing up. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had hired, were now conveniently clearing her husband was not very convincing. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lyde thought the psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off of her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John's family had lost faith in her, but what they didn't know was that she still had one more card to play. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder. At this point, Corporal Lyde finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, asking them to take over the investigation. Lyde's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of time, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Hughes had gotten more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt like the psychics had given them just as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed. This meant Lyde was losing her case. On the one hand, this was the exact thing that Lyde had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency she had expected. And so now, even though it definitely stung, Lyde realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. And so, Lyde went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out the little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick. Her officer had brought them to her right after John's autopsy. She had been told to send them to the state police crime lab right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, she had decided not to do that, and instead she put the samples in the fridge and she waited. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in, it made the case much more high profile, and that in turn allowed Lade to send the samples not to the State Police Crime Lab, but to the FBI Crime Lab, a much higher authority. Normally, the FBI would never take samples from a small-town murder case. But now that it was this huge public case making national news, Lade knew she could take advantage of the situation. So, she repackaged the fingernail clippings and the other samples, she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back, Lade was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading. Her strategy of intentionally slow-playing the investigation and sitting on this evidence until this very moment had totally paid off. Finally, on her computer screen, Corporal Lade was looking at the name of John Yelnick's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of April 13, 2006. Around 12:30 in the morning, the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer got out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching. It was dark and completely silent. So, the killer left the street, walked around to the back of the house, and slipped inside through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room, where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist. They walked right up to John, raised the blade high, and then brought it down directly onto him. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming. He put his hands up to try to protect himself and even tried clawing at his attacker, getting the killer's skin underneath his fingernails. John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. He got up and began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down and the two began to wrestle. As they struggled, the killer kept stabbing John. John was flailing his arms, trying to fight back, and he hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, sending them flying everywhere. And then, somehow, on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. He made it to the front foyer and actually reached for the front doorknob. But the killer shoved him from behind. John went flying towards the pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head crashed right through it. When his head went through the glass, a sharp shard severed his jugular vein, and John bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer watched until John was completely still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood with them. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because they were someone people trusted with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley, and the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Lade had decided not to send that evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lade knew Kevin and she liked him. She had basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she started hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. This was partly because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled to be totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin completely believed them. And so, Lade had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer. And she was afraid that her case would be taken over, not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was terrified that if Kevin was guilty, she couldn't really trust the State Police Crime Lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would find out about the evidence and try to interfere himself. It was just too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence there. So Lade had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she had held on to the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then, she slow-played her investigation, biding her time until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case. And that's when Led got her access to the FBI Crime Lab. The FBI scientists finally tested the DNA that was found under John's fingernails and found that it was a perfect match for Kevin Foley. In the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never charged in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! Everyone sometimes we're faced with decisions that seem impossible. Choices where every option leads to a terrible outcome. Imagine being trapped in a burning building high above the ground. You have to decide right now whether you stay and face the flames or jump. There is no right answer. There is no good outcome, and when we hear about these situations, we can't help but ask ourselves, what would I do? I want you to hold on to that question because the story today is about two best friends who found themselves in a situation so hopeless, so completely desperate, that they were forced to make a truly unthinkable choice. On the morning of August 5th, 1999, 26-year-old David Coughlin woke up inside his sleeping bag. He was in a green and maroon tent pitched in a remote part of New Mexico called Rattlesnake Canyon. As he sat up, he could hear the familiar sounds of his best friend, Rafi Kudikian, already outside getting their breakfast ready and packing up their gear for the day's hike. A smile crept across David's face. This was it. This was the trip of a lifetime. Just 6 days earlier, he and Rafi had said goodbye to their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts. They had packed up Rafi's red Mazda and started driving west more than 2,000 miles across the country. Their final destination was Santa Barbara, California. David had been accepted into a prestigious master's program for environmental engineering at a university there. It was the start of a whole new chapter in his life. But instead of just flying out, the two friends decided to turn the cross-country move into a massive road trip, a final great adventure. They stopped at cheap motels and different campsites along the way, but Carlsbad Caverns National Park was by far their favorite spot. It was nothing like the small, crowded campgrounds they had stayed at before. Carlsbad was huge, almost 47,000 acres of rugged, wild desert. For David and Rafi, who were used to the city and a couple of pretty standard desk jobs, this felt incredible. It was like they were explorers, cowboys venturing into the untamed American West. It was a thrilling escape from their normal, safe lives. As David sat in the tent, he noticed he was already starting to sweat. Even though it was early, the sun was already beating down and the heat was building. He reached for his water bottle and took a small sip. He remembered the park ranger at the visitor's center just the day before. When they were filling out the paperwork for their one-night backcountry permit for Rattlesnake Canyon, the ranger had been very serious. He had looked them both in the eye and stressed that they needed to carry at least 1 gallon of water per person for each day they were out there. The New Mexico desert in August was no joke, but after they left the ranger's station, Rafi had just kind of laughed it off. Rafi was the more experienced outdoorsman of the two, and he told David that the ranger was just being overly cautious. He said 1 gallon per person was total overkill for a simple overnight trip. So, instead of lugging 2 huge heavy gallons of water with them, Rafi had decided they would only bring 3 16-ounce bottles of water, total, for both of them. To put that in perspective, that was about 6 times less water than the park ranger had recommended. They had already used one of those small bottles the night before to boil some hot dogs for dinner. And the bottle David was drinking from now was already half empty. That left them with just 1 full bottle and a little bit more. But David wasn't worried, not really. He trusted Rafi's judgment. Besides, their plan was to hike out of the canyon that very morning, get back to their car, and continue their journey to California. They knew they had set up their tent just a short distance from the parking lot. It would be an easy walk. So, David put the cap back on his water bottle, got out of his sleeping bag, and stepped out of the tent to join his friend. By 8:30 in the morning, their campsite was completely packed up, and the two friends were on the trail heading back to the car. They walked at a relaxed pace, following what they believed was the correct path. For about an hour, everything seemed fine. They saw the little trail markers, these small stacks of white rocks that other hikers had left, so they knew they were going in the right direction. But after an hour of walking, they still hadn't seen the parking lot. They both knew they should have reached it by now. Still, they weren't panicking. They figured it had to be just around the next bend, maybe over the next small rise. They stopped for a moment, took a few more sips of their dwindling water supply, and then kept walking. Another hour passed. Then another. They were now walking for 3 hours, and the sun was climbing higher and higher in the sky. The heat was becoming intense, and there was still no sign of the parking lot. In fact, they weren't seeing anything familiar at all. The stacks of white rocks that had marked the trail were gone. They had no idea where they were. They were completely and totally lost, trying their best to stay calm. David and Rafi stopped, dropped their packs on the dusty ground, and pulled out their topographical map. They spread it out and stared at it, hoping to find some landmark, some feature that could tell them where they were. But neither of them really knew how to read a map like this. The swirling contour lines that represented the canyons and ridges just looked like a confusing jumble. The map was useless, frustration started to set in, it was getting hotter by the minute. They thought about just getting up and continuing to walk in the general direction they thought was right, but as soon as they stood up, a wave of exhaustion hit them both. The heat and the hours of walking had already taken a serious toll. They spotted a bit of shade under some shrubs growing out from a canyon wall. They walked over, collapsed under the meager shade, and just sat there in silence. The reality of their situation was starting to sink in. They did not have the supplies to be out here for much longer, and their lack of water, which had seemed like no big deal just a few hours ago, was now starting to feel like a massive, life-threatening mistake. But then, just as despair was about to take hold, a stroke of luck. Huge, dark storm clouds rolled in overhead, and suddenly, a torrential downpour began. Rain hammered down on the dry desert. David and Raffi scrambled to catch the raindrops in their mouths. They licked water off of rocks and leaves. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. It was enough to rehydrate them a little and, more importantly, to lift their spirits. They felt like they had been given a second chance. After the short storm passed, they decided their only option was to keep walking. They had to find that parking lot. But despite their renewed sense of motivation, they walked for hours and hours, deep into the night, and found nothing. Finally, exhausted and defeated, they knew they had to stop. They would have to spend another night in the desert. They found a small, washed-out gully and set up their green and maroon tent. By now, the fear was very real. Neither of them could sleep. They just sat outside the tent, trying to reassure each other. They kept saying that the park rangers would definitely have noticed by now that they hadn't returned. Their one-day permit had expired. Surely someone would come looking for them. But deep down, they both knew that was just wishful thinking. They had no idea how long it would take for rangers to realize two hikers were overdue. As they were talking, their eyes scanning the dark horizon, they saw it. Far in the distance, 2 points of light that looked exactly like headlights on a car. The lights were moving slowly across the top of a ridge. A road. It had to be a road. A wave of relief washed over them. They didn't need the park rangers after all. They could save themselves. All they had to do was get to that road. Suddenly, all their hunger and thirst and fear were forgotten. They were filled with hope. They crawled into their sleeping bags and fell asleep almost instantly, just dreaming of the morning, when the daylight would come and they could hike to that road and get back to their lives. They woke up early the next morning, eager to get moving. But they made a critical decision. Instead of packing up their entire campsite and lugging it with them, they decided to leave most of it behind. They would travel light and fast to get to the road. But just in case, they wanted to leave a note for any park rangers who might come looking for them. David took out a journal from his pack. Inside, he drew a simple, crude map showing the location of their campsite and an arrow pointing towards the ridge where they had seen the lights. He also wrote down his and Raffi's names, their ages, where they were from, and some emergency contact information. He added a critical detail. They were completely out of food and water. He ended the note with a plea, "If you find this journal, please follow up and make sure we made it out okay." They left the open journal in the middle of their campsite and set off. They walked for hours up a long, gradual incline heading for the ridge. The terrain got tougher and tougher. The final approach to the top of the ridge was a steep wall covered in cactus. The small gullies that led up were filled with loose, slippery rock, making it almost impossible to climb. Remember, these two men were already exhausted, dehydrated, and weak from lack of food. Every single step was a struggle. But eventually, after a massive effort, they pulled themselves up over the edge of the ridge. They stood up, looked out, and their hearts sank. There was no road. There was nothing. Just more empty desert stretching out as far as the eye could see. They had no idea what those lights had been. Maybe it wasn't headlights. Maybe, in their desperate state, they had just imagined it all. As they stood there in stunned silence, a single buzzard began circling slowly in the sky above their heads. It was like it was just waiting. Waiting for them to collapse, waiting for them to die. At that moment, David was ready to give up. He wanted to turn back, go to the campsite, and just wait for a rescue that might never come. But Raffi insisted they keep going. He said maybe the road was just a little bit further, so they pushed on, walking for a couple more hours. But they found nothing. They were just getting deeper and deeper into the wilderness. Finally, even Raffi had to admit defeat. The walk back to their campsite was agonizing. It was a slow, painful trudge, made worse by the crushing disappointment. All the way back, they kept telling themselves, maybe the rangers are there now. Maybe we'll get back and a search party will be waiting. But when they finally stumbled back into their camp, it was exactly as they had left it. The journal with their desperate note was still sitting right there, untouched. No one had been there. No one was coming. And at that moment, their spirits were just completely and utterly broken. The next morning was Saturday, August 7th. It was their 4th day in the desert and their 3rd full day without any water. Their bodies were starting to shut down. Raffi had become violently ill from drinking his own urine in a desperate attempt to stay hydrated. David was suffering from horrible stomach cramps, likely from eating unripe prickly pear cactus fruit. His legs were starting to seize up with cramps, making it nearly impossible for him to even stand, let alone walk. They both knew there was no chance of hiking out now. Their only hope, their only slim chance of survival, was to be rescued. With the tiny bit of energy they had left, they tried to make a huge SOS signal on the ground using rocks. They managed to spell out the S and the O, but they were too weak to gather enough rocks for the final S. Their distress signal was left unfinished. Later, Raffi had another idea. He took his polyester sleeping bag, soaked it in camping fuel, and lit it on fire. He was hoping to create a huge plume of black smoke that someone somewhere might see. But the smoke never got high enough. It just dissipated in the hot desert air. All he had accomplished was destroying his sleeping bag and filling their small campsite with a terrible chemical stench of burning plastic. By that afternoon, with the sun at its peak, beating down relentlessly, David and Raffi could do nothing more. They crawled inside their tent to escape the heat and just lay there in silence. They noticed that the loose rocks on the ground underneath the tent floor felt slightly cool to the touch. In a daze, they took out a knife, cut the entire floor out of the tent, and just lay directly on the cooler rocks. That evening, as darkness fell and still no rescuers had appeared, they both began to accept that this was probably the end. They were going to die out here. David picked up the same journal where he had drawn the map. He turned to a clean page and wrote a final goodbye letter to his girlfriend. He knew he would never see her again. Then he passed the journal to Raffi. Raffi wrote his own notes, but he added a chilling line. He wrote that he would not let the buzzards get them. He would make sure their bodies were found intact for their families. After writing their last words, they tucked the journal away. As it got cooler, they crawled out of the tent and sat under the stars. They began to talk, a very quiet, matter-of-fact conversation about the reality of their situation. Both men were emotional. At one point, David just broke down completely, screaming and crying in sheer despair. They talked for a long time, and at the end of that conversation, they came to a decision. A pact. An unthinkable solution to an impossible problem. Once they had both agreed on the plan, they crawled back inside the tent and zipped the flap shut. It was the next afternoon, August 8, 1999, when a park ranger named Lance Matson stood looking at a dusty red Mazda. It was parked in an otherwise empty lot at the trailhead for Rattlesnake Canyon. He checked his records. The two men who owned this car, David Coughlin and Raffi Kodikian, had taken out a one-night permit. That permit had expired 3 days ago. Now, Lance wasn't overly concerned. This happens sometimes. People misjudged their time or decided to stay longer. Mostly, he was just annoyed. It meant he and the park volunteer he was with had to hike out into the canyon and find these guys. So Lance and the volunteer started walking down the trail. They had been walking for less than a mile when they saw it. Just off the trail, a green and maroon tent was pitched out in the open. Lance figured this had to be them. His annoyance turned to relief. This was going to be an easy job. He could talk to them, figure out what was going on, and get them on their way. But as he and the volunteer left the trail and walked closer to the tent, they started to realize something was very wrong. First, they smelled it. A horrible, sharp, chemical burning smell. Then they saw bits of burned trash scattered all over the ground around the campsite. And when they finally stood right in front of the tent, its flap zipped tightly shut, they saw movement inside. Something or someone was shifting around in there, but there was no sound. Not a single word. Lance and the volunteer looked at each other, their hearts starting to race. They were both nervous. On impulse, Lance reached down, grabbed the zipper, and pulled the tent flap open. And what he saw inside sent a wave of cold fear through him. Lying on his side on the rocky ground was Raffi Kodikian. He was wearing nothing but a pair of filthy green shorts. He was emaciated, his skin was cracked and blistered, his eyes were sunken. He looked like he was just moments from death. When Raffi saw Lance, he whispered, "Please tell me you have some water." Lance did have water, and he quickly gave it to him. He knew Raffi was supposed to be with someone else. He asked him, "Where is the other guy you were with?" Raffi, while gulping down the water, just casually lifted a weak arm and pointed out of the tent somewhere off towards the canyon wall behind Lance. Lance and the volunteer turned and looked. They saw nothing, just desert, scrub, and rock. Lance turned back to Raffi. "Are you sure? I don't see anyone." Raffi didn't say a word. With a completely blank expression on his face, he just continued to point. "He's right over there." Feeling a growing sense of dread, Lance got up and started walking in the direction Raffi was pointing. Before he reached the canyon wall, he almost tripped. He looked down and saw a mound of rocks about the size of a human body. It was clear that someone had deliberately arranged them this way. It looked like a makeshift grave. With his heart pounding in his chest, Lance reached down and carefully moved one of the larger rocks aside. And underneath, he saw David Coughlin's face. It turned out that on that last night, when David and Raffi sat outside their tent having that final desperate conversation, they were discussing how to die. They knew they were not going to survive. Dehydration or starvation would get them soon. They were terrified of being attacked by an animal in their weakened state. There was no hope left. David had pulled out his small pocket knife and tried to end his own life by cutting his wrists. But he was too weak, and the blade wasn't sharp enough. He couldn't do it. So he had turned to his best friend. He begged Raffi, "You have to kill me." And then he told him after he was gone, Raffi had to kill himself, and Raffi had agreed. They went back inside the tent. David lay down on his back on the rocks and pulled up his shirt, exposing his chest. Raffi took out his 4-inch pocket knife and placed the tip against David's ribcage. With David urging him on, begging him to do it, Raffi tried to push the knife into his heart, but he couldn't break through the skin. David was screaming in pain, but still telling Raffi to just do it, to finish it. Finally, with all his strength, Raffi managed to force the knife between David's ribs and into his heart. David didn't die instantly. Raffi covered his friend's mouth and held him, pushing the knife in deeper until he was gone. Then, with the last of his energy, Raffi dragged his best friend's body a short distance from the tent. He gathered rocks and buried him. Then, completely spent, Raffi crawled back into the tent, lay down on the cool rocks where his friend had just died, and waited for his own death. But just a few hours later, Lance the park ranger had arrived. The most tragic part of this whole story is that the campsite where they had spent days suffering, where one friend had killed the other, was only a 15 or 20-minute walk from their car. They had been that close to safety the entire time. 9 months later, on May 11, 2000, Raffi Kodikian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But throughout the entire legal process, Raffi never wavered from his story. He insisted that he only killed David because David had begged him to. This was a mercy killing, the final act in what was supposed to be a murder-suicide pact. And David's family, in an incredible act of compassion, believed him. They advocated for Raffi, telling the court they did not believe he was a monster. A judge agreed. And so, in the end, Raffi would only serve 16 months in prison before he was released. He was a free man, but he would have to live with the memory of what happened in that desert for the rest of his life. And the worst part is, they were never truly far away from safety. Somewhere beyond those canyon walls, less than 20 minutes away, their car sat waiting in the desert sun the entire time. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, sometimes the deadliest place on Earth isn't the middle of nowhere. Sometimes it's only a few wrong turns away.